一体何が見えるってんだよ。そんな、あの壁は50メートルだぞ。やつだ。
Alright, so this video is going to be quite a bit different to the normal stuff I upload. It's going to be a lot of talking and actually zero gameplay. So in making this video, I wanted each of the decks that I list to fit under a certain couple of criteria. First of all, I wanted each list to be completely free to play and easily obtainable with gems. That means no structure decks. Despite structure decks being a fairly cheap way to play Duel Links, they're not free to play, and I know the majority of people that do click this video will be looking for a free to play alternative to the standard kind of cards that only use gems to purchase them. Secondly, I wanted each deck to have a vast majority of the cards all come from the same box. There is one exception to this in my list, but there is a reason for that which I'll talk about when we get to it. And lastly, each deck obviously has to be competitively viable. Obviously this is a budget list, so not every deck on here is going to be super high tiered, but every deck on here is at least competitively viable and can be used to climb with. Alright, so this list will go from what I think is the weakest to the strongest, starting with our first deck, Despot. So Despot have never really been considered good enough to quite reach the top tiers, but they have always been this kind of rogue style King of Games worthy deck that some consider to be an anti-Six Samurai deck, which definitely boosted its popularity, especially on the release considering the popularity of that deck, and they were in the same box. For those of you that don't know what Despots are, they're basically a Floodish style deck which consists of a bunch of 500 attack machine monsters that aim to buff themselves to pretty extreme levels, reaching attack stats of over 5000. Of all the deck lists on this list, the core of this one is by far the cheapest, with not a single Despot being SR or Ultra Rare, and even the backline of this deck being something that can be very easily swapped around, since it doesn't actually have any staple backline cards. Revive effects are generally pretty good, considering we run Despot 002, who on special summon receives his search effect, and he's pretty easily sent to the graveyard. This makes resurrection cards like Powerful Rebirth and Limited Reverse good options for the deck, considering all your Despots are below 1000 attack and a level 4 or lower, other than 9. They are also machine types, meaning we can delve a little bit into that archetype, with cards like Pulse Mines and Machine Duplication being fantastic free to play friendly alternatives. You may also see that my list contains Concentrating Current, which is another nice alternative considering it comes in the same set as the rest of the core of this deck, which by the way is the main box Warriors Unite. So you can also pick up this deck whilst building towards something like Six Samurai, which is in the same set. Another reason this deck is so cheap, which you'll notice is a recurring theme with the rest of the deck list I'm going to show, is that this deck does not require an extra deck, meaning you can play it and just ignore that completely. Next up, we have my boy YouTube Dan's signature deck list, Hazy Flame. So this deck is the anti-meta deck that you will see pop up in and out of the meta fairly frequently, with it having extreme highs and also pretty bad lows. Most of you will probably remember this deck from one of the more recent KC Cups, just after Six Samurai released, and were considered by far the most popular deck to face, which meant this deck's popularity spiked drastically, since it was a hard counter, which is something that's extremely unique and rare, considering old decks really don't come back in a power creeping style game like Duel Links, without the archetype receiving new support, which Haze didn't really receive. For those of you that don't know the Hazy archetype, basically they are an all monster deck consisting of a bunch of level 5 monsters that cannot be targeted by card effects, that are very easily floodable, and thanks to their level, makes for very easy OTKs when combined with the skill Beatdown. It is because of this untargetable effect that this deck gets to pop in and out of the meta very regularly, and can be always considered a fantastic budget deck, because even if they are not super strong now, I can almost guarantee that they will be again in the future. Now this is the deck list that I mentioned at the start that broke the list requirements of the majority of the cards needing to come from the same box. But the reason for this is because this deck is extremely interchangeable, as once you have the core of the Hazy Flame deck, which is located in the Blades of Spirit mini box, and the card trader, the rest of the deck can be swapped around completely. This is because other than the main monsters of the deck, The rest of the deck are all just monsters that aim to do roughly the same thing, and that is be special summonable as to not take up your normal summon for the turn, so you may tribute them to summon your hazy monsters. So if you don't have the cards that I'm showing in my deck list, don't worry, as there are plenty of other monsters that fill the gap, such as Cock-a-doodle-doo, the Tricky, Cyber Dragon, Diatherum, Unknown Synchro, Parry Knights, and many more. Another cool thing about this list is that it's actually a pretty nice fit for Jinzo, due to that card also only needing one tribute. And once again, it does not need an extra deck, so you can completely cheap out on that. Next up, we have the deck designed for Fairies, for hire. So this deck was once the king of Duel Links. It was an extremely free to play deck that absolutely dominated its time, to the point where it had to get 3 cards of its core put on the ban list. For those of you that don't know the art type, For Hire is basically a flood style art type that truly covers all grounds with its effects. It has removal for both frontline and backline, it has built-in negation, it can bring cards back from the grave, it can banish cards from the grave, and every card is extremely easily searchable. And on top of that, most of their effects have the added bonus effect of being able to special summon another fairy from your hand. Now after saying all that, I don't want to get your hopes up by thinking this deck is some unstoppable force. To be honest, it's not even tiered anymore. But that doesn't mean it's not a strong road deck, with plenty of people still reaching king of games with it despite its age. Every single card in the core of this deck is obtainable through the Clash of Wings mini box, with all of them being lower than SR rarity besides beat, which you can obtain 2 copies of before having to reset the box for the third. Just like Despot, this deck once again doesn't require an extra deck, and the deck's backline is completely interchangeable and up to you based on what cards you have. If you have Canadias and Floodgates, stuff them in. If you don't, it doesn't matter, just play something like Legacy Clash or War of D instead. Now you will notice that I do have a Dimensional Prison in the free to play example I've shown, and that is because it happens to come in the same box, so if you do happen to get it whilst digging for the deck, shove it in. The final thing to mention with this deck is kind of more of a fun thing than anything, and isn't something I exactly recommend, as it's not really an improvement for the deck. And that is that you can run Obelisk the Tormentor in this list, due to how easily it floods. It's kinda silly, but at the same time, I wouldn't run this deck without it, as it feels a hell of a lot more fun to play. Next up, we have our first current meta and recently nerfed deck list, and that is Subterra. This is a deck that up until the Mars Tribute nerf was considered the best deck in the game, and even now is still considered to be within the top 3 tiers, and even seeing a lot of play during the World Championship, which is a pretty strong testament to the strength of this deck. Although, I'm going to say it now, this deck list won't be the exact same as the few shown at Worlds, as the more optimal way to play this deck is currently through Neos Fusion, but honestly, this deck is beyond playable without it. For those of you that don't know of this archetype, basically it's a flip deck that is based around big boss monsters that all have unique effects, such as banish removal and backline removal, that can all be used during your opponent's turn thanks to the insane trap card Final Battle. This deck is probably the most expensive of the decks I'm going to show, as it's contained all within the same main box Blazing Rose, and despite the majority of the core of this deck all being below SR, it still does need Final Battle and Behemoth, which you can get away with only running 2 of since it's searchable, but I do highly recommend at least getting the 3rd Final Battle, since that isn't searchable and the deck is ridiculously stronger if you open with it. Once again, other than Final Battle, the backline of this deck is completely optional and unrestricted due to you not actually running any banned cards, and it does not require a single extra deck card to be run. Do keep in mind though that this deck list specifically does need the skill to be able to run it. You do need Labyrinth Builder if you want to run this deck kind of in a more optimal way, since it is your replacement for the recently nerfed Mars Tribute, so if you don't have that skill, make sure you get it before trying to play this deck. And finally, the best free to play deck in the game right now, in my opinion, is Trimid. This deck is insane, getting a ton of play during the World Championship, and is currently sitting at roughly tier 2 despite how cheap it actually is to play. For those of you that don't know the archetype, Trimids are a control style deck list that rely on low level monsters to interchange field spells to fit into whatever situation you need, as well as to fill up the graveyard with cards to use as ammunition for the archetype's signature removal card, Trimid Pulse. Of all the decks on this list, this one is by far the hardest and will take the most time to learn, as it's definitely one of the more skilled decks in the game, at least in my opinion. The core of this deck can all be obtained through the Guardians of Rock mini box, other than Pulse, which is a card trader card. And once again, just like Subterra, despite the majority of its core being lower rarity than SR, you do still need Cruiser and Master, which are both SR and require a box reset to get at least 2 copies of, which even at 2 is still pretty consistent, but I would recommend resetting at least once more to try and get a 3rd Cruiser, as it does make the deck just that little bit more consistent. Just like the other decks on this list, no extra deck is required, and other than Pulse, the backline is completely up to you. Just make sure you are only using trap cards though, as the best way to run this deck is with balance. Alright guys, that's basically it for this video. If you guys have any free to play deck lists you'd like to recommend yourself, or you disagree with my list, feel free to leave them in the comment section down below. Also, I would really appreciate feedback on this video, since I've never really done one of these kind of list style videos before, at least not for a very long time anyway. So if you do have any feedback for me, please let me know. Also, each of the deck lists I have shown in this video will be linked in the description if you guys just want the deck code. Other than that, make sure to like, subscribe, comment if you have any questions or feedback. Thank you guys for watching, and hope to see you in the next one. Also, make sure to join my Discord, link at the top of the description.
Hey, big brother, can I watch SpongeBob?
Shut up, Mokuba. I'm busy flagging YouTube videos to compensate for the fact that I have an extremely small penis.
Oh.